Las Vegas is currently enduring the most brutal, sustained heat wave in its entire recorded history, and the complex network of infrastructure that keeps the city alive in the desert, its power grid, is failing. Pavement on the streets has become hot enough to inflict third-degree burns on human skin in a matter of seconds. The images are apocalyptic. A crippling heat dome, a high-pressure lid of stagnant air, has locked itself over the American Southwest, pushing temperatures in Las Vegas to 117 degrees Fahrenheit, or 47 degrees Celsius, for 12 consecutive days. That is a record. Ambulance dispatches for heat-related emergencies have surged by over 300%. The city's main trauma center is treating severe burns not from fire, but from simple contact with the ground. Road surfaces have been measured at over 180 degrees. The city is, quite literally, cooking itself. If you've ever experienced an extreme weather event like this, tell us about it in the comments. Understanding the scale of these events begins with sharing our experiences. Now, a critical note, a large majority of people who find these reports valuable forget to subscribe. We are a small team, and your subscription is not just a number. It is the core support that allows us to investigate and produce this work. It takes 1 second, it is free, and it is the single most important way to ensure we can continue. Please, click subscribe now. It's an emergency for us. Let's begin. This is how it happened. The event, which meteorologists are calling a generational heat dome, began to build in late June. By July 3rd, the National Weather Service in Las Vegas issued its first excessive heat warning, but this was different. The warnings are common in a desert summer. This one carried a new tone of urgency. The forecast predicted not just a peak but a plateau, a long flat line of extreme heat with no relief in sight. Day after day. For the first 72 hours, the city's systems held. Air conditioners hummed, drawing colossal amounts of power. Tourists, confined to the climate-controlled corridors of the Strip, were insulated from the reality unfolding outside. But then the city's physical limits began to show. The system started to fray at its edges. On the 5th day of the heat wave, a transformer in a residential neighborhood in Henderson exploded. It was not a grand, catastrophic failure. It was a small, localized event, a metal box on a utility pole that could no longer cope with the demand and the ambient temperature. For 400 homes, the power went out. And in 116-degree heat, a home without air conditioning is not an inconvenience. It becomes a convection oven. Within an hour, temperatures inside those houses climbed past 100 degrees. An elderly woman, a resident of that neighborhood for 30 years, called 911. She was disoriented, dizzy. By the time paramedics arrived, her internal body temperature was 105 degrees. She was in the throes of heat stroke. This was not an isolated incident. Across the valley, dozens of similar events were happening in silence. The power grid was not failing all at once. It was dying a death by 1,000 cuts. And here's the detail that tells the real story. For more than a decade, utility experts and climate scientists have filed reports with the Nevada Public Utilities Commission. These reports warned, in stark, unambiguous language, that NV Energy's infrastructure was not prepared for a prolonged, multi-day heat event above 115 degrees. A 2018 study explicitly modeled this exact scenario. It predicted widespread equipment failure, specifically citing the aging transformers in older residential areas, the very ones that were now beginning to fail. That is not a recent discovery. That is documented knowledge, filed and formally acknowledged, of a critical vulnerability in the system that powers a city of 2 million people. And NV Energy's response throughout the crisis has been a series of statements assuring the public that the grid is stable and meeting record demand. While on the ground, entire communities were being plunged into darkness, their homes transformed into inescapable traps. The statements from corporate headquarters and the reality on the street were two different worlds. One was public relations. The other was a public health emergency. It's clear there's a disconnect between official statements and the reality people are facing. We want to know, have you ever felt that an official warning didn't match the danger you were experiencing? Let us know below. To understand the immense pressure on the system, one must look at the numbers. On the 8th day of the heat wave, Nevada Energy reported a new all-time peak power demand of 8,650 megawatts. The previous day, it had set a record. The day before that, another record. For a solid week, the city was consuming more electricity than at any point in its history. Every single day. The Hoover Dam, the region's iconic power source, provides less than a quarter of the power needed. The rest is generated by a network of natural gas plants and increasingly solar arrays. But the solar farms, vast seas of photovoltaic panels baking in the desert, have their own cruel irony. In extreme heat, their efficiency drops. The very phenomenon they are meant to combat degrades their ability to function. Past a certain temperature, the panels themselves become too hot to operate at peak capacity. The city was demanding more power while its key renewable sources were being throttled by the heat itself. Here is what that strain looked like. In the control room of NV Energy, engineers were engaged in a desperate minute-by-minute balancing act. They were buying emergency power from neighboring states like California and Arizona at exorbitant prices. But those states were also in the grip of the same heat dome. Their own grids stretched to the breaking point. There was simply not enough excess power to go around. The utility initiated its demand response programs, remotely cycling air conditioners off for thousands of volunteer customers who had opted into the program. It was a digital triage, an attempt to shed load wherever they could to prevent a system-wide collapse, a collapse that would plunge the entire Las Vegas Valley into a blackout, a scenario that emergency planners refer to as catastrophic. In a city where life is impossible without air conditioning, a total grid failure is a mass casualty event. The people who work outside, they see the city in a way no one else does. For them, this isn't a story about megawatts or policy. It's about survival. Think about the construction crews building the city's future skyline. They start their shifts at 3 a.m. trying to beat the sun, but by 9 a.m. the air temperature is already 105 degrees. The steel beams they work on, exposed to direct sunlight, can reach 190 degrees. Hot enough to cook meat. Hot enough to cause a burn through a leather glove. A construction worker on a project near the Strip described the feeling. He said the air itself feels solid. Breathing is like inhaling from an oven. Your tools, if you set them down in the sun for 30 seconds, are too hot to pick up without gloves. Several workers on his site had collapsed from heat exhaustion. Not heat stroke, the more severe condition, but the precursor. They were pulled off the job, rehydrated, and sent home. But others across the valley were not as fortunate. Paramedics reported calls to construction sites where men were found unconscious, their bodies no longer sweating, a terrifying sign that their internal cooling mechanism had failed completely. While you're watching, if you find this information important, please take a moment to like this video and share it, especially with family and friends who live in areas prone to extreme weather. Awareness is the first step toward preparation. This leads to the city's most vulnerable. Las Vegas has one of the nation's largest per capita homeless populations. For them, there is no air-conditioned home to retreat to. The streets themselves have become the enemy. The city, along with nonprofits, operates a network of cooling centers. These are libraries, community centers, and dedicated shelters where people can escape the heat during the day. They save lives. But here is the critical flaw in the system. Most of these centers close at 5 or 6 p.m. They are a daytime solution to a 24-hour problem. As the sun sets, the temperature may drop from 117 to 105. It is still dangerously hot, but the concrete and asphalt, having absorbed solar radiation all day, begin to release that heat back into the environment. The ground becomes a heating element. A person sleeping on a sidewalk is effectively sleeping on a low-grade hot plate. This is the source of the horrific burns that the UMC Lions Burn Care Center has been treating. Dr. Syed Saqib, the center's director, told local media that they have seen a dramatic spike in contact burns. People, often elderly or disoriented from the heat, fall and are unable to get up quickly, or the homeless, seeking rest, lie down on the pavement. In seconds, their skin is seared. That is the reality on the ground. A burn unit in the middle of the desert is treating injuries that one would expect from a house fire, but they are coming from the pavement. The very foundation of the city has been weaponized by the heat. Outreach teams from groups like the Nevada Homeless Alliance scour the streets, handing out water and trying to coax people into the remaining overnight shelters. But the scale of the problem is overwhelming. One outreach worker, who has been doing this job for 5 years, said she has never seen anything like this. She described finding a man sitting under a pedestrian overpass, lucid but physically unable to stand. He had run out of water hours earlier. The plastic bottle he was holding had warped from the heat of the ground it was resting on. She said the desperation in people's eyes is different this time. It is not just discomfort. It is the palpable fear of not surviving the night. And then there is the second front of this crisis: water. Las Vegas gets 90% of its water from the Colorado River via Lake Mead. The lake, held back by the Hoover Dam, is already at catastrophically low levels due to a 20-year megadrought. The extreme heat acts as a powerful accelerant. On a hot day, the process of evaporation can pull more than 1 billion gallons of water out of Lake Mead. 1 billion gallons, turned to vapor, every single day. The heat wave is literally drinking the city's future water supply. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has implemented some of the most aggressive water conservation policies in the country. They have banned non-functional turf grass at commercial properties and pay residents to tear out their lawns. But the city's core industry, tourism, has a voracious thirst. The massive casino resorts on the Strip use elaborate systems of cooling towers to power their air conditioning. These towers work by evaporating water to dissipate heat. They are highly efficient, but they consume millions of gallons a day. During a heat wave, that consumption skyrockets. So at the very moment when evaporation from the lake is at its peak, the demand for water to fight the heat on the ground also peaks. It is a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. Here is what was happening behind the scenes. The Water Authority was monitoring the intake pipes at Lake Mead. There are 3 of them, drilled at different depths. The top intake pipe is already exposed, a dry concrete cylinder high above the waterline, a monument to the disappearing lake. The system is currently drawing from the second pipe. Projections made before this heat wave suggested that, under worst-case drought scenarios, the lake level could drop below that second intake within a few years. This heat wave represents that worst-case scenario, compressed into a few weeks. Every day of 117-degree heat is pulling those projections closer to the present. The margin for error is shrinking, while tourists watch the Bellagio fountains dance. A few miles away, the source of that water is in a state of terminal decline, accelerated by the very heat the fountains offer an illusion of relief from. I know we've already asked, but the truth is, these deep dives are only possible because a small fraction of our viewers support us. It's a tough reality of independent channels. If you believe this reporting is necessary and are one of the many who haven't subscribed yet, please consider it. It truly is our lifeline. We appreciate it. The cumulative effect of this heat is not just on people or power. It is on the physical fabric of the city itself. The materials that compose the urban environment are being pushed past their design limits. The Department of Transportation in Nevada began reporting incidents of asphalt bleeding, where the liquid petroleum binder in the asphalt rises to the surface, creating a slick, sticky, and dangerous mess. In several areas, roads have begun to show signs of buckling. This happens when the concrete or asphalt expands in the heat with such force that it has nowhere to go but up, creating large, destructive cracks and bumps. It's a slow-motion explosion of the ground itself. At Harry Reid International Airport, one of the busiest in the world, flight operations were impacted. While modern jets are certified to take off in high temperatures, the physics of flight are unforgiving. Hot air is less dense than cool air. This means engines produce less thrust, and wings generate less lift. To compensate, planes need more runway to get airborne, or they need to reduce their weight. Several afternoon flights were delayed, waiting for the temperature to dip just a few degrees. In some cases, airlines were forced to bump passengers or cargo, unable to take off at full weight in the thin hot air. The heat was imposing a physical limit on the city's connection to the outside world. This is not just an inconvenience, it demonstrates how a single environmental stressor can cascade through transportation, logistics, and the economy. The entire city is an intricate machine, and the heat was throwing sand into every gear. And here is what is not making most headlines: the ecological collapse happening in the margins. The Mojave Desert is a tough, resilient ecosystem, but this event is beyond the pale. Biologists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began receiving reports of birds literally falling out of the sky. Smaller species, unable to find water or escape the heat, were simply dying in mid-air. The region's iconic Joshua trees, already stressed by climate change and wildfires, were showing signs of severe dehydration, their spiky leaves browning and curling. Native animals, from desert tortoises to coyotes, were driven by desperation to venture further into urban areas in search of water from swimming pools and irrigation systems, putting them in conflict with humans and vehicles. This is an ecosystem being boiled alive. The foundation of the natural world that the city was built upon is coming apart. The response from the city and state government has been a full-court press on public messaging. Daily press conferences urging hydration, press releases detailing cooling center locations, social media posts with tips for saving energy. All of this is necessary, it is crucial, but it is also a reactive posture. It is an attempt to manage a crisis that is already unfolding. Critics point to years, even decades, of policy decisions that prioritized explosive growth over sustainable design. They point to the vast seas of black asphalt parking lots that surround every commercial development, acting as massive heat sinks. They point to zoning codes that allowed for master-planned communities with minimal green space or tree cover. Here is the detail that frames the entire problem. In 2021, a consortium of climate scientists at UNLV published a paper on the urban heat island effect in Las Vegas. The study's conclusion was that without a radical and immediate shift in urban planning, mandating cool pavement technology, aggressive tree planting, and distributed green spaces, the city would face unlivable summer conditions within 30 years. The report was presented to the Clark County Commission. It was acknowledged. And then, development continued largely as it had before. Vast warehouses with acres of unshaded rooftops were approved. New housing tracts with dark asphalt roads and minimal vegetation were built. The warnings were clear. The science was undisputed. But the economic momentum of growth was more powerful. Now, just a few years later, those unlivable conditions are no longer a future projection. They have arrived. This is the third and final time, I promise. But if you've made it this far, it means you care about these issues. You are exactly the kind of viewer we need in our community. Please take this moment to subscribe. It makes all the difference for us to continue telling these stories. Thank you so much. The crisis is also exposing social and economic fissures. The experience of this heat wave is vastly different depending on your zip code. In the affluent, master-planned community of Summerlin, with more mature landscaping and lighter-colored building materials, the ambient temperature can be 5 to 10 degrees cooler than in the older, denser neighborhoods of East Las Vegas. There, the housing stock is older, less insulated, with less tree cover and more asphalt. The residents are more likely to be lower income, working service jobs that do not stop for the heat. They are less able to afford a spike in their electricity bill from running the AC 24/7. They are the ones who feel the failure of a single transformer most acutely. The heat wave is not a universal experience. It is a social multiplier amplifying the inequalities that already exist. It is falling hardest on those with the fewest resources to fight back. And what of the future? The immediate crisis may pass. The heat dome will eventually weaken and move on. Temperatures will drop back to a more normal summer baseline of 105 degrees. But the system has been wounded. The power grid is weakened, with countless components stressed to their breaking point, awaiting the next peak demand day. The water level in Lake Mead is permanently lower. The invisible damage to infrastructure, the micro cracks in roads and pipes, will remain. This was not a singular event that will pass without a trace. It was an acceleration. And now the city faces a second paradoxical threat. The same atmospheric conditions that create punishing heat domes can also pave the way for a powerful monsoon season. After weeks of baking the ground into a hard, impermeable shell, a sudden deluge of rain cannot be absorbed. It runs off instantly, turning dry desert washes into violent torrents and streets into rivers. The very areas most baked by the heat are now the most vulnerable to catastrophic flash flooding. The community that was just trying to survive being cooked is now at risk of drowning. It is a 1-2 punch that the desert environment is uniquely vulnerable to. Fire and flood, heat and deluge. The extremes are becoming more extreme. The question now is not whether Las Vegas will recover from this specific heat wave. It will. The question is, what happens when a heat wave like this is no longer a record-breaking event but a regular occurrence every summer? What happens when the power grid is subjected to this level of stress not for 2 weeks, but for 4 or 6? When the evaporation from Lake Mead is permanently accelerated? When the city's outdoor workforce is subjected to unsurvivable conditions for a third of the year? The city's officials state they are exploring new technologies and strategies. NV Energy insists it is investing in a more resilient grid. But while those plans are debated and budgets are allocated, the sun keeps rising. The pavement is still hot enough to burn skin. The water in the reservoir is still disappearing, and the next forecast is calling for another spike in temperature, another test of a system that has already shown it can break.